I'm starting with a very non-bat skill testing question. What is this a picture of? It is Linnaeus's house. And that's his garden out front that's still arranged as he would have had it. Very good. I should have brought a Halloween treat for who can answer my question. I usually toss candy at my first year class if they actually volunteer information. So. I'll try not to throw candy today. Right, so I was asked to give some sort of brief talk about something that was bat-related for Halloween. It's amazing how popular I get around Halloween for giving lectures. And something that also incorporated some sort of new research aspect to it. So I'm going to try and do that and give you a bit of an idea of some of the work we do now to try and see what bats see. I wasn't interested in bats at first. I had no particular love of them. But I've been accidentally working with bats now for about 15 years. And I mostly study feeding ecology. So we are geneticists in my group, we're taxonomists, but what we really do now is study food webs using those tools. So a Royal Mail brings me a lot of bat fecal samples, and they all get subjected to molecular analysis to figure out what bats are eating around the world. But given that I've been studying bats and bat feeding ecology for a decade, this picture is something I've never seen. So a bat chasing down a small insect. In this case, it's called a gnat. It's kind of like a midge. But this kind of behavior is something we don't often see. And that's one of the things that makes it interesting, because it happens in a way that most of us can't access. So this is a large bat in Central America eating a very, very large katydid, but even this is a behavior you can't watch. And so we have to often infer that bats are hunting or eating something. They are most famous for echolocation, although there are many bats that do not echolocate. That's a common mistake people make. There's lots of bats that can't do it. But echolocation is certainly the skill that they are most well known for. And echolocation is a very simple idea. You send out a signal, you broadcast it out, it hits an object, and it bounces back to you. And in most cases of echolocation, the delay between your two receivers gives you an idea of what direction that echo came from. So if the insect was off to the right for you, and it will come back to one ear faster than the other, you can locate to a certain extent where it is. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's the principle of it. It's the same way that we've modeled for radar and all the kinds of sensory stuff we use in applications all the time. If something's right in front of you, for instance, it might come back to the receivers at the same time. That's the principle of it. Most people have heard this far in the story of how bats navigate. The other aspect of it then is how do prey figure out that they are being hunted. And it's a very, very famous evolutionary arms race between the echolocation ability of bats and the ears of insects. That's going to put a symbol over it. But this is an insect, and every one of those colorful dots is actually a location that we have found ears. So many, many, many insects have ears, and they have them all over their bodies. They've got them in their wings. They've got them in their legs, in their bodies, in their heads. They can put ears everywhere. And quite famously later on, if you ask me nicely over lunch, I'll try to repeat a poem written about insects and their ears, the only poem that I know of ever published in the journal Nature by a former colleague. But the interesting thing about insects is that their ears are getting better and better and better to try and hear the bats coming faster and sooner, and the bats are getting better and better and better at making noise to try and evade the sensory system of the insects. So it leads to these absolutely fabulous. That's a moth in the middle being chased down. Absolutely astonishing aerodynamics as bats attempt to capture their prey in the air. And most bats that are hunting insects are doing it this way. This is called aerial hawking, and it's what I think bats are probably famous for. Notice that it's scooping into its lower wing membrane as opposed to biting it with its mouth. There's a good reason to do that, because as soon as you bite something with your mouth, you can't see anymore because you've lost your echolocation. So a lot of them actually capture with their legs or with their tail membrane so that they can still echolocate to land to eat. So credit to one of my friends, Aaron, who does this type of photography. So pretty astonishing aerodynamics and acrobatics that these insects and the bats are performing in the air in order to be part of this ongoing coevolutionary race between hearing and producing sound. But what we tend to discount in this is that there's lots and lots of bats who aren't any good at this. So this is one of the most common nectar bats. You can think of it as the hummingbird of the bat world, found in Central and South America. These things are pollinators. That's a banana flower. They're incredibly important pollinators. They're also very, very good seed dispersers. So here are some seeds that have been dropped on a forest floor that have been chewed by bats. So little things like those tiny seeds at the top, big things like avocados being dropped around. Bats are one of the best seed dispersers in tropical forests. They're better than birds. They're better than insects, partly because they can carry much heavier things around. They're one of the first groups that get there to try and reclaim habitat that's been disturbed by spreading seeds into it, so that they're ecologically extremely important for things other than insectivory. But the first story I want to tell is about this little bat, which is famous for its pollination and seed dispersal. Here's a photograph of it with its face all sticky from having been licking nectar out of a flower. So this is what it's known for. But if you read some stories about this bat, Glossophaga, you hear all kinds of interesting descriptions, like occasional resource-driven insectivory, or opportunistically take insects at flowers. And the reality is that even hummingbirds that are famous for visiting flowers can't survive on sugar water. Almost no vertebrate can. It's a really, really lousy source of nutrition, and so you have to get nitrogen and protein from somewhere. So there's lots of good footage now of hummingbirds taking insects. And the question we were asking was, what do these guys do? Because they're not particularly well adapted to live on sugar water. They carry their offspring around with them. Birds don't do that. They have very high energetic demands. You can't supply that with just sugar. So where are they getting the rest of their nutrition from? So one of the very first experiments that we ran with this technology we developed for looking at the diet of bats in more detail was carried out at the University of Bristol. So this is one of my field sites in Costa Rica. That's actually my dad in the corner there, who was my field assistant one year. And we went down and we looked at colonies of these Glossophaga nectar bats. And we collected lots and lots and lots of their fecal samples, their guano, and we sequenced them looking not for the plant material they're famous for, but for any insect DNA we could find in their gut system. At the same time, the University of Bristol for a few years had a captive colony of these bats that were living there that we could study in a confined area. They were bats that had been born in captivity, and they'd only ever been fed on a protein-spiked diet of pollen and nectar. So they had never seen an insect. So we did two things. One, in the wild, we surveyed them at their fecal samples at the genetic level to see whether or not they consume insects. And in the lab, we simply gave them some mealworms on strings. We hung in front of them, and then we listened and watched them to see what they did. And the reason this was interesting was that these bats are really, really bad at echolocating. They aren't very good at it. So they shouldn't, their echolocation is weak and quiet and made for finding a giant flower that wants to be found. When you're trying to capture something that doesn't want to be found, you need to be better at it than that. So the question was, if they eat insects, how the heck do they do that? So when we scanned their fecal samples, the answer to the question was very, very quickly, yes, they eat lots and lots and lots of insects. And when we looked at what insects they were consuming, not only were they insects that were not associated with the plants they visit, so they weren't just opportunistically eating an insect when it was hovering in front of the plant with them. These were things they were actively hunting in the wild. And the second thing that was interesting about them was most of them had ears. So these are insects that should be able to hear a bat coming, that have these wonderful ears that have evolved to hear bat echolocation. So how does a bat with really bad echolocation win this race and eat all these prey? In our captive colony, we wanted to see if they could actually do it. So here's a movie of these guys approaching a feeder. So what you can see there in the very center is actually a mealworm on a string, and there's the bat coming for it. So they're not always successful. Tried very hard to get it off the string, but I tied it on too hard. But you can see he really wants it. Sometimes they beat the researchers at their own game. This one came up with a really unique solution to the problem of how to get the mealworm off a string. He just hung upside down and ate it. But these are bats who've never seen an insect before. Why should they want to eat something? They've got plenty of food sitting in a bowl they can eat from. So these are making very, very classic insectivorous approaches. So there's no hovering like you would with a flower. They just go right up and grab it. And that one got it. Neat thing is, how do they chew? Because these bats are missing quite a lot of their teeth. They don't have the same teeth as insectivores normally do. They're actually pushing the food into the back where they still have good molars. And then they use their thumbs and their wrists and their wings to manipulate that food to make sure they can hold on to it. She's actually using his great big thumb and pushing the food backwards into its mouth continuously. And then they got so interested they started stealing food from each other. So that's what happens when you look at it, you watch these bats. These are bats never seen insects before, haven't got any trouble handling them, eating them, consuming them, and taking them off strings that are just hovering in the air. So we've got this evidence from the wild that, yes, they do this in nature. We've got the evidence from the lab that suggests that this is an innate behavior. They certainly know how to do this. They didn't learn it. They are born knowing that, because a naive bat can do it without much assistance. Then the question becomes how. So we've got a group of bats that are really, really good at this, doing it in the wild with lousy echolocation, eating a group of insects that are supposed to be very, very well adapted to evade attacking bats. So this is where I went to some of my colleagues who study echolocation, and I said, okay, here's the problem, figure it out for me. So they took the recordings that we'd made in the lab to see how did these naive bats actually approach the target. So how do they go up and take this insect away? And this is, I promise, the only graph I will show you. So what we have here is how loud a bat is yelling. Okay? So most people don't think about echolocation, but it's actually extremely loud. And lots of bats, if we could hear them, it's the equivalent of having something like a lorry go past you at about 2 feet away. They're really loud. Okay? And the louder you yell, the further away you can actually detect prey, because your sound goes further. It comes back to you. But if you're yelling loudly, the insect is going to hear you from further away and have more of a chance to get away. Okay? So what we have here is bat yelling loud, and the solid line is the bat. So as you yell louder, you can find prey that are further and further away. The dotted line is the moth. So as the bat yells louder, the moth hears you from further and further away. But notice that these curves aren't the same. They're actually crossing. So at some point down here, only the bat hears the moth. It isn't yelling loud enough to trigger the sensory cells in the ear that cause it to hear something. Over here, they both hear each other. And over here, you would have a position where the moth hears the bat before the bat knows the moth is there. At this point, where the red dot is, they basically have an equal chance. The bat hears the moth at about the same time the moth hears the bat coming. When we look at what Glossophaga, these little nectar bats, are doing, all of their echolocation is here. Okay? In the section where, quite clearly, the bat hears the moth, but the moth can't hear the bat coming. So these bats with really poor echolocation are winning because they whisper. Okay? So they're just not yelling loud enough. And this continuous arms race that has pushed echolocation to get better, faster, higher frequency, louder, to get the moth quicker, and the moth's ear that's racing to keep up, to hear the bat from further and further away to get an advantage, has left this big gap where if a bat sneaks in and can use this sort of stealth approach to just creep up really quietly, the moth simply never knows the bat's coming. So these guys win at this by actually being bad at it. So we called this stealth hawking, and there are 2 bats in the world that are known to do this. One is in England, Barbastells, and one is now in the tropics, Glossophaga. And there's a lot of bats in the tropics that are called whispering bats because they have lousy echolocation. And they all tend to be frugivores or nectar bats. Now, we've shown one of them can do this. My suspicion is that this is an extremely widely used technique, but we haven't tested that hypothesis yet. So here's a bat that has basically one at the fight with moths simply because it isn't very good at the skill it's trying to do. The second little story I want to tell you is also about echolocation, but it allows us to actually, it's a technology that we invented at Bristol to allow us to turn sound into a picture, so we have some idea of what bats are actually perceiving about the world. That's the hardest thing, is we're very visual creatures. To take away our vision and try to imagine what the world would be like acoustically is quite difficult to perceive. And so we have this technology that was invented at Bristol to try and turn sound into a picture so we get some idea. And we've done this a couple times now. And the story I'd like to tell here is about a bat called Micronycteris. And Micronycteris is an insectivore. It's a very small bat, about this big. And it, unlike the bats that come and swoop and take things out of the air, it's famous for flying up to a leaf and then staying there for a very long time, just hovering, watching the leaf. And they, in fact, fly around to a patch of leaves, the same patch every night. And they feed right off the leaf. And this is a fundamentally different way of feeding than to grab something out of the air. Because in the air, something's moving, and it's easier to see something when it's moving. If an insect is sitting on a leaf and it's very still, the question becomes, how do you find it? So what is it about that object on a surface that the bat is seeing? It makes it much more difficult. And this has huge, huge interest in applications from people who use radar. So you've always got the problem of something on a surface, a background to surface noise. It becomes very difficult to distinguish those. So an object hanging in midair, easy. An object on a surface, very hard. So this is a case where we're going to the bats to figure out how they do it, to try and see if we can improve the way we might do it. So the technology that was invented is called acoustic tomography. And I bet many of you have actually been the recipients of tomographic scans. This is how CT scans work. If you've ever had a CT scan, same technology. So you send out some sort of pulse, you get information back, it gets converted into a picture. We're doing it with the acoustic scenario of a bat. So we have basically a rotating platform, and you can put a prey item on it. And then we built a little robotic bat. It's just a small mouth that emits noise like a bat and an ear, which records it as it comes back. It sends out a noise, it records the echo that comes back. We then send that little bat in an arc over top of the object, and we spin the object around underneath it. So we eventually get echoes that come from an entire sphere around the object. Those echoes can then be integrated into see what a picture looks like. So if I took something really simple, like a ball, and I stick it on this platform, and I just scan it in a circle, the picture comes back and looks like this. So a small object or a big object, we can turn the echoes that come back into a picture that gives an idea of where the echoes came from. So in this case, all we've done is scan in a circle, and we can draw that circle using just the information that bounces back. So what happens if we take a prey item like this? Okay, so there's my moth. He's got a pin holding him in place. These are specimens. And he's got his wings pointing up like this. And if we scan it, and he's sitting on a piece of slate. So now we've scanned it, and we can actually see the returning echoes give us a pretty good idea of the body and the wings. And they also give us a measurement of the surface that it's sitting on. Oh, I told you I wouldn't be. There's another graph. But we can measure many things from this. One thing we measure is depth. So a piece of sound that bounces off the tip of that leaf is going to come back faster than a bit of sound that bounces off the slate and comes back. So there's a delay. And that gives us an idea of how deep the object is, so a depth profile. We can also measure this thing that we started calling a shadow. So the sound that bounces back from underneath those wings is being muffled by the wings. So some of it does get through and come back, but it becomes muffled. And this is casting a shadow on the object. So then we got interested in whether or not the background mattered. So here's the same moth on some rough bark, on a leaf, on a piece of slate, and on a rock. And we scanned all of those, doing exactly the same thing. And we scanned the backgrounds to see what they look like normally. So now we have our moth sitting on top of these backgrounds, and we adjust the backgrounds. And you can do things like simply measure how loud was the echo here, and how loud was it when there was something sitting on top of it. And what we discovered here is quite important. It turns out that the actual echoes that come back from the moth aren't very interesting. Yeah, you can get depth, but it's not that powerful. The most interesting thing is missing background. So as your surface becomes smoother, like this piece of slate, that background shadow becomes really obvious. Now, if you're the one that's most similar to slate is a leaf. And when you have a moth sitting on top of it, you basically have missing leaf. And so if you're a micronectarist and you're out in the wild and you're hunting around your patch and you go visit the same leaves every night, you develop an idea of what leaf looks like. This is my leaf. And when you're visiting it and you scan it with acoustic information, you probably don't see the moth that's sitting there. But what you see is a hole in the leaf. And so the moth is sitting there, the bat comes through, scans and goes leaf, 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 and then knows there's something sitting there. So what we think bats are doing is not looking for objects on leaves, they're looking for leaves. And if they can't find the leaf they know is there, they know there's an object, and then they attack it. And it turns out it really matters where you hunt. So if you're hunting on something that looks like this, it's a pretty variable background anyways. But if you're hunting on something that looks more like this, you're going to see missing background really easily. And in fact, this is what it looks like to them. So this is the same moth sitting on a leaf or sitting on a bit of rough bark. Now, even to us, visually, that's camouflage. So it's hard to pick out the edges of a rough moth on rough bark visually. Turns out acoustically it's just as difficult. And there may be a very good reason why micronectarist hunts on leaves, because it's really obvious. But they're not looking for the prey, they're looking for the missing background. And so there's two things here. One is bats are probably hunting surfaces, not objects on them. And that's why micronectarist has a patch that is theirs, that they know really well. And the other side of this is if you're a moth and you need to go and rest, you should pick a rough surface and camouflage yourself both visually for the birds and acoustically for the bats. So this is a new form of camouflage that we hadn't known existed before. It's effectively an acoustic camouflage that they can hide themselves in. And it may explain both why lots and lots of moths rest on bark. It may also explain why micronectarist hunts on leaves. So it's looking for the ones that make mistakes. So there's my two stories about effectively the acoustic systems of bats. One, winning by being bad at it. Another one, winning by learning how to find the right surfaces to hunt on. And since this is the end of Halloween and we're in the Linnean Society looking at a place that's known for taxonomy, I thought I would give you an idea of the diversity of bats in the world, because I've only shown you two of them. I am a bat taxonomist. There are something like 1,300 known species of bat in the world. They range in size from about that big to 6-foot wingspans. My best estimate, and a lot of my colleagues would agree, that about 40% of them are not known to science. So every time we look at a bat, we tend to find another one. Most people think of bats looking something like this, small, brownish, gray animals. That's what most of the ones in England would look like. But in fact, they're hugely variable. So these are just pictures of bats I have seen. This, many of them are known for these enormous ears. This is a little bat from Texas. They come in a variety of colors. This one looks a lot like a cotton ball with wings. They're about this big. They look like little puffs of white floss with yellow skin. They actually have black wings with yellow stripes. So color and stripes are really well known in bats. We're not really sure why they have so many different colors and stripes and spots, but they do. There's bats that have great big white spots. There's bats that have orange heads. There's one that's actually colloquially called the Halloween bat. I have not seen it, but it is black with orange stripes. One of the most famous, these are the vampire bats, quite famous for their behavior. They can run, they can walk. They have two little pits right there, which are heat sensors. So that's how they locate prey. They look for heat sources. Bats with very tiny faces. So these are usually pretty good echolocators if they have very reduced eyes. Other bats, this one you can hear it if it goes past. It clicks like a cricket. It's not particularly good at echolocating. It's very low frequency. Bats in bright colors. These are naturalist bats. They're one of the highest frequency echolocators I've ever seen. So these are 150, 160 kilohertz, if you know about frequencies at the lowest, so up to 200 kilohertz. Bats that smile. Bats that glow. Bats that are orange. And probably the weirdest looking bat in the world. We still have no idea why it looks like this. So a lot of people think it looks like it's had its skin taken off its face. Its mouth is actually this slit down here. Its eyes always look like they're missing the eyelids. The best guess we have is that all of these little channels on its face are for somehow forcing liquid from fruit to run towards its mouth, like a little river system. It's famous for really juicy fruit. That's what it eats. But it has a very strange face and very strange skull. I've only seen 2 of these. Anyways, I will stop there. That's my 20 minutes. So I'm happy to take questions about bats.